The evening was crisp and alive, with the low hum of conversation as family and friends filled our home. The dining table was adorned with steaming dishes, the smell of roasted chicken and rosemary wafting through the air. Laughter echoed from the living room, where my husband, James, entertained a few of his friends. His jokes were loud and animated, his charisma undeniable. But it wasn't directed at me. It hadn't been in years. I busied myself in the kitchen, arranging dessert trays and topping off glasses of wine. It was my way of avoiding the slow realization that our marriage had shifted from passion to mere coexistence. James hadn't touched me, not really touched me, in months. There were no glances that lingered, no hands that brushed mine in passing. Our love had been replaced by habit, and I wasn't sure when it happened or how to undo it. The sound of a deep, familiar voice startled me from my thoughts. "Need any help in here?" "Hmm?" Robert, my father-in-law, stepped into the kitchen, carrying a warmth that seemed to fill the entire room. He was a striking man, even in his 60s, silver hair swept back, his broad shoulders still strong from decades of work. His eyes, a sharp shade of blue, crinkled with kindness as he offered me a small smile. I shook my head quickly, trying to push away the odd flutter in my stomach. No, I've got it all under control. Thank you, though. Robert leaned against the counter, crossing his arms casually. "You're always working so hard. You deserve to enjoy your own party, don't you think?" I forced a laugh, wiping my hands on a kitchen towel. Old habits die hard, I guess. He chuckled softly, the sound rumbling like distant thunder. "I suppose James has gotten used to you taking care of everything." His words carried no malice, but they cut deeper than I wanted to admit. My husband had indeed grown accustomed to me being the one who made life seamless. It wasn't malicious, just oblivious. But hearing it from someone else, even in passing, made the sting sharper. "Someone has to," I replied lightly, hoping to mask the bitterness creeping into my tone. Robert's gaze lingered, thoughtful and piercing, as if he could see past my facade. "You're a good woman, Elise. You've always been too good for him." I paused, unsure of how to respond. Was he joking? Was this his way of teasing me? Though this expression remained sincere, the words hanging between us heavy and unspoken. I felt my face flush, this sudden attention from him making my pulse quicken. Thank you, Robert," I stammered, looking away to focus on slicing the pie in front of me. The knife trembled slightly in my grip, and I cursed my body for betraying me. He moved closer, the space between us narrowing until I could feel the faint warmth radiating from him. "You should hear it more often," he murmured, his voice low and intimate. My breath caught in my throat as his hand brushed against mine, deliberate yet fleeting, like a whisper of something unspoken. The contact was electric, a spark that sent shivers cascading down my spine. I dropped the knife, the clatter breaking the moment as I quickly stepped back. I think I need to check on the guests," I said hurriedly, avoiding his gaze. Robert nodded, his face unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something knowing. "Of course," he said, stepping back to give me space. "I'll let you get back to it." I fled the kitchen, my heart pounding against my ribs as I rejoined the party. The room was warm and alive with conversation, but it felt hollow. My eyes flickered toward Robert, who had seamlessly rejoined the group, laughing at something James had said. He caught my gaze for the briefest of moments, and a small, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I was hyper aware of Robert's presence, of the way he moved through the room with an ease that drew others to him. My husband, on the other hand, barely acknowledged me, too engrossed in his conversations to notice the unease written across my face. When the guests finally left and the house fell silent, I stood in the kitchen cleaning up the remnants of the evening. My hands moved mechanically, scrubbing plates and wiping down counters, but my mind was elsewhere. On the way Robert had looked at me, on the way his touch had lingered, as if daring me to notice it. "Elise?" I jumped, dropping the glass I was holding. It shattered against the sink, shards scattering like a broken constellation. I turned to see Robert standing in the doorway, his expression a mix of concern and something I couldn't quite place. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," he said, stepping forward to help. "I just wanted to thank you for hosting tonight. Everything was perfect, as always." I knelt down to pick up the larger shards of glass, my movements clumsy under his gaze. "Thank you," I mumbled. "It's no big deal." He crouched beside me, his hand brushing mine again as he reached for a piece of glass. I froze, the proximity between us suddenly unbearable. He didn't pull away this time, his touch lingering as his fingers curled around mine. "Elise," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's not my place, but are you happy?" The question hit me like a wave, knocking the air from my lungs. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Was I happy? The question felt foreign, like something I hadn't allowed myself to ask in years. Ugh. My voice cracked, and I shook my head, trying to focus on the task at hand. "It's complicated." Robert's hand tightened slightly around mine, his warmth grounding me. "You deserve more," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I looked up at him, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. His face was inches from mine, his blue eyes searching mine for something. Understanding, perhaps. His breath was warm against my skin, and I realized with a jolt that we were too close, far too close. "I should go," he said suddenly, standing up and stepping back. The spell broke, and the tension in the room dissipated like smoke. "Good night, Elise." "Good night," I whispered, watching as he left the room. When I was finally alone, I leaned against the counter, my legs trembling beneath me. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to answer, with feelings I didn't want to name. What had just happened, and why, deep down, did I want it to happen again? The days that followed the party felt heavier than usual, laden with unspoken words and lingering glances that haunted me. I couldn't stop replaying that moment in the kitchen, the way Robert's hand had lingered on mine, the way his voice had cut through my carefully constructed facade. It was like he had seen straight through me, exposing feelings I hadn't dared to acknowledge, even to myself. James, of course, remained blissfully unaware of anything amiss. He left early for work each morning and came home late, his days consumed by deadlines and meetings. We existed in the same space, but the emotional distance between us felt insurmountable. I told myself that Robert's attention was simply a harmless spark in an otherwise dull routine, but deep down I knew it was more than that. It started with small things. The morning after the party, Robert dropped by to return a serving platter he'd taken home, claiming it had been forgotten in the shuffle of cleaning up. I hadn't expected to see him so soon, and my heart fluttered at the sight of him standing on my doorstep, holding the platter in one hand and a charming smile on his face. "I figured you'd need this back," he said, his tone light but his eyes betraying something deeper. "Oh," I stammered, reaching for the dish. "Thanks, Robert. That was thoughtful." He lingered on the porch for a moment, his gaze steady. "How are you feeling today?" "Fine," I replied quickly. Too quickly. Why wouldn't I be? He raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his expression. "No reason, just checking in." Our exchange was brief, but it left me rattled. I watched him walk back to his car, his confident strides unhurried. He didn't look back, but something in me wished he had. From that moment, Robert seemed to find reasons to be around more often. He would stop by to check on the lawn or borrow a tool, always under the pretense of helping James. But James was never home when he came by, and somehow it was always me who answered the door. The conversations we shared were innocuous at first, discussions about the weather, neighborhood gossip, even tips on gardening. But beneath the surface there was an energy between us, a current that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. It was in the way his eyes lingered on mine a second too long, the way his voice softened when he spoke my name. One afternoon I was out in the garden pulling weeds from the flower beds when Robert appeared unannounced. He leaned against the fence, his sleeves rolled up, exposing strong forearms that hinted at years of manual labor. The sight of him made my pulse quicken. "You shouldn't be doing that alone," he said, his voice tinged with mock reproach. "You'll hurt your back." I laughed, brushing dirt from my gloves. "I think I can handle a few weeds." He stepped closer, crossing the yard with an easy confidence. "At least let me help." Before I could protest, he knelt beside me, his hands deftly pulling at the stubborn roots. For a moment, we worked in silence, the only sound the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. The nearness of him was intoxicating, his presence filling the small space between us. "You're good at this," I said finally, my voice shaky. He smiled, glancing at me sideways. "Years of practice. My mother used to make me weed the garden every Saturday as a kid. Hated it then, but I guess it stuck." There was a warmth in his tone, a rare glimpse into his past that made him feel more human, more real. I found myself leaning closer, drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. "Thanks for helping," I said softly. He looked at me then, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that stole my breath. "Any time, Elise." That evening, as I prepared dinner, I found myself thinking about Robert's hands, the way they moved with purpose, the way they brushed against mine as we worked side by side. I shook my head, chastising myself for letting my thoughts wander. This wasn't who I was. I loved James, or at least I used to. But love felt like a distant memory now, replaced by a quiet longing for something I couldn't name. It wasn't just about Robert. It was about the way he made me feel seen, like I wasn't just a ghost moving through the motions of my own life. The turning point came one rainy afternoon. James was out of town for a conference, leaving me alone in the house with nothing but the sound of rain tapping against the windows. I curled up on the couch with a book, trying to lose myself in the fictional world, but my mind kept drifting back to him. When the knock came at the door, my heart leapt. I knew who it was before I even opened it. Robert stood there, soaked from the rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. He held a toolbox in one hand, a sheepish grin on his face. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice low. "Thought I'd check on that gutter James mentioned. Didn't realize the weather would turn so quickly." "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "You're drenched." He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, his presence filling the room. I handed him a towel, my hands trembling as they brushed against his. He took it, his fingers grazing mine in a way that sent a jolt through me. "Thanks," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We stood there in the entryway, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. The rain continued to pour outside, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the pounding of my heart. "Robert," I began, unsure of what I was even trying to say. But before I could finish, he stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "Elise," he said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of longing and restraint. Whatever he was about to say was lost as he stepped back suddenly, shaking his head as if trying to clear his thoughts. "I should go." "Wait," I blurted out, my voice louder than I intended. He froze, his hand on the doorknob, and turned to face me. For a moment, neither of us moved, the tension between us crackling like static electricity. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, he closed the distance between us, his hand cupping my cheek. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice trembling with vulnerability. "But this can't happen." I felt my breath hitch, my heart shattering and soaring all at once. "I know," I whispered, "but it already has." The days blurred together after that rainy afternoon. My heart ached with a mixture of longing and guilt. Every moment I spent alone was consumed by the memory of Robert's touch, his voice trembling as he admitted what we both already knew. Something had shifted between us, something neither of us could ignore. James came home from his business trip the following evening. He greeted me with a distracted peck on the cheek, his mind already immersed in some work crisis. I cooked dinner while he rattled off updates about his day, but I barely heard a word he said. My thoughts were elsewhere, spiraling around the question I dared not ask myself. What now? A week later, the opportunity presented itself. It was a Saturday afternoon, one of those lazy days where time seemed to stretch and bend. James had left early to play golf with some friends, his absence expected to last well into the evening. I told myself I'd use the day to catch up on household chores, but instead I found myself staring out the kitchen window, waiting for someone. When Robert's car pulled into the driveway, my heart leapt into my throat. He stepped out, dressed in jeans and a plain white t-shirt that clung to his broad shoulders. He carried a toolbox, his movements purposeful as he approached the front door. I opened it before he could knock, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Hi," I said, my voice barely audible. "Hi," he replied, his eyes scanning my face as if searching for a clue to my thoughts. "I figured I'd fix that gutter. The rain's supposed to come back tomorrow." "Of course," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Thank you." He moved past me, his shoulder brushing mine, and the brief contact sent a shiver down my spine. I closed the door and followed him into the house, my hands trembling as I tried to keep my breathing steady. Robert worked quietly, his focus seemingly on the task at hand, but the tension in the air was palpable. I found myself hovering nearby, offering tools or wiping surfaces that didn't need cleaning, just to have an excuse to be close to him. At one point he paused, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "You don't have to stick around," he said, his tone casual but his eyes betraying a flicker of something deeper. "I can handle this." "I don't mind," I said quickly, my voice betraying more than I intended. He looked at me then, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us moved, the weight of everything left unsaid, hanging between us. And then, as if drawn by an invisible thread, he stepped closer. "Elise," he said softly, his voice low and steady, "we can't keep doing this." "I know," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. He reached out, his fingers grazing my arm in a gesture that was both hesitant and deliberate. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice trembling. "Tell me this is wrong, and I'll leave, I swear." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, I reached for him, my hand resting lightly on his chest. His heart thundered beneath my palm, matching the frantic rhythm of my own. In that moment, the world seemed to fall away. There were no consequences, no lingering guilt, only the two of us, and the electric pull that had been building for weeks. The first kiss was tentative, a soft brush of lips that quickly deepened as the floodgates burst open. His hands slid around my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, my fingers tangling in his hair. The intensity of the moment was overwhelming, every nerve ending in my body alight with sensation. "Are you sure about this?" he murmured against my lips, his breath warm and ragged. I nodded, my voice barely a whisper. "I've never been more sure of anything." He hesitated for a moment longer, his gaze searching mine, and then he kissed me again with a fervor that left no room for doubt. The afternoon passed in a haze of stolen moments and whispered confessions. We didn't cross every line, but we came close enough to feel the gravity of what we were doing. The air between us was charged with a mixture of passion and fear, the knowledge that we were teetering on the edge of something that could never be undone. When it was over, we sat in silence on the couch, the reality of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy fog. Robert ran a hand through his hair, his expression torn between guilt and longing. "This can't happen again," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I know," I replied, though my heart screamed otherwise. He turned to face me, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and tenderness. "You're an incredible woman, Elise. You deserve so much more than this." His words cut deep, the truth of them undeniable. I had spent so long convincing myself that my life was enough, that I didn't need more than what James offered me. But Robert had shattered that illusion, forcing me to confront the emptiness I had been ignoring for years. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He sighed, leaning back against the couch. "We go back to our lives. Pretend this never happened. I wish you and I were discovering it first, rather than through a bloody noose we found." The thought of it made my chest ache, but I nodded, knowing there was no other option. "Okay." He stood then, his movements slow and deliberate as if reluctant to leave. "Take care of yourself, Elise," he said softly. "You too," I replied, watching as he walked to the door. He paused for a moment, his hand on the doorknob, before turning back to look at me. "And Elise?" "Yes." "Don't let anyone know what we just did." The words hung in the air long after he left, a stark reminder of the line we had crossed and the secrets we now shared. I leaned back against the couch, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, each one more confusing than the last. What had I done? And why, despite everything, did I want to do it all over again? In the days following my encounter with Robert, my life felt like a balancing act on the edge of a knife. On the surface, everything seemed normal. James left early for work, I handled household chores, and life carried on. But beneath the surface, I was unraveling. My thoughts were consumed by Robert. Every word, every touch, every lingering glance replayed in my mind, pulling me deeper into a sea of guilt and longing. James, as always, was oblivious. He'd been busy with a new project, spending late nights at the office, and barely acknowledging my existence when he came home. Normally, his absence would sting, but now it felt like a reprieve. It gave me space to process the storm of emotions tearing through me. But no amount of distance could quiet the voice in my head screaming that what I'd done was wrong. Every time I looked at James, I felt the weight of my betrayal crushing down on me. And yet, despite the guilt, I couldn't stop thinking about Robert. The way he made me feel alive, seen, wanted. It was intoxicating. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in the bedroom when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. My heart leapt as I saw Robert's name on the screen. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I knew the right thing to do was to ignore him, to let this end before it spiraled further out of control. But my resolve crumbled under the weight of my own desires. I typed back a quick response before I could second-guess myself. "Where and where?" His reply came almost instantly. "The park. Half an hour." The park was quiet when I arrived, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. I spotted Robert sitting on a bench beneath a large oak tree, his posture tense, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. As I approached, he looked up, and the relief in his eyes was unmistakable. "You came," he said softly, standing as I reached him. "I shouldn't have," I replied, my voice trembling, "but here I am." He gestured for me to sit, and we both settled onto the bench, an awkward silence hanging between us. Finally, he broke it. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice raw. "I've tried, but it's impossible." I looked down at my hands, my fingers twisting in my lap. "I feel the same way, but that doesn't mean this is right." "Right or wrong stopped mattering the moment we crossed that line," he said, his tone firm. "The only thing that matters now is what we do next." "And what do you think we should do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, but I can't keep pretending like nothing happened. I won't." His words sent a shiver through me. I wanted to tell him that we could stop, that we could go back to the way things were before. But I knew it was a lie. There was no going back. Not now, not ever. "Oh, we have to be careful," I said finally, my voice trembling. "James can't find out." His jaw tightened, and he nodded. "I understand." The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered conversations. Robert and I avoided each other as much as possible, but when we did cross paths, the tension was palpable. A brush of fingers as he handed me a tool, a lingering glance across the room. It was enough to send my heart racing. James, meanwhile, began to notice the cracks in the facade. He would catch me staring off into space, lost in thought, and ask if I was okay. I always brushed it off, claiming I was tired or distracted, but I could see the suspicion growing in his eyes. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, James set his fork down and looked at me, his expression serious. "Elise," he said, his tone soft but firm. "Is everything okay?" My heart skipped a beat, panic flaring in my chest. "Of course," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Why do you ask?" "You've seemed distant lately," he replied, his brow furrowed. "I just want to make sure you're okay." I nodded, my throat tightening. I'm fine. Really." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he gave me a small, sad smile and returned to his meal, the silence between us heavier than ever. The breaking point came one Sunday afternoon. James had gone out for a round of golf with friends, leaving me alone in the house. I was in the kitchen, absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone, when I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My heart leapt, both with anticipation and fear, as I saw Robert stepping out of his car. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice sharp as I opened the door. "I needed to see you," he said, his expression earnest. "I couldn't stay away." "You can't just show up like this," I said, glancing over my shoulder. "What if James comes home?" "I don't care," he said, stepping closer. "I needed to know where we stand, Elise. I can't keep living like this, wondering, waiting." "Robert, please," I whispered, my voice breaking. "This is dangerous." "Dangerous or not, I won't pretend anymore," he said, his voice firm. "Do you want this or not?" Before I could answer, the sound of a car engine roared down the street. My stomach dropped as James's car pulled into the driveway. Panic surged through me, and I shoved Robert toward the side door. "Go," I hissed. "Now." He hesitated, his eyes searching mine, but the urgency in my voice spurred him into action. He slipped out the door just as James walked in, a bag of groceries in hand. "Hey," James said, setting the bag on the counter. "You okay? You look flustered." "I'm fine," I said quickly, forcing a laugh. "Just startled me." He gave me a curious look, but didn't press the issue. Instead, he began unpacking the groceries, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside me. As I watched him, the weight of what I'd done threatened to crush me. The web of lies I'd spun was unraveling, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The morning was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that seemed to vibrate with a warning. James had left early for work, leaving the house to me. But despite the silence, my mind was far from peaceful. My thoughts were a tangled mess of guilt, longing, and dread. The previous afternoon's encounter with Robert still lingered in my mind. His desperate eyes, his words, "I can't keep pretending," echoed in my ears. And then the sound of James' car pulling into the driveway had sent me into a frantic spiral. Somehow, Robert had slipped away unnoticed, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the carefully constructed walls I had built around my secret began to crumble. Later that day, I was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television, when my phone buzzed. My heart leapt as I saw Robert's name on the screen. A single message flashed across the screen. "We need to talk. Please." I hesitated, my fingers trembling as I typed a response. "Not now. James might come home early." His reply came quickly. "I can't keep waiting, Elise. I'll meet you wherever you feel safe. Just say the word." I sighed, my heart heavy. I knew I should tell him to leave me alone, to let things die before they spiraled even further out of control, but instead, I found myself typing back. "The park, 7 p.m. The park was bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun when I arrived. Robert was already there, sitting on a bench beneath a large oak tree. He looked up as I approached, his expression a mix of relief and worry. "You came?" he said softly, standing as I reached him. I nodded, my throat tightening. "What is it, Robert?" He gestured for me to sit, and I hesitated before lowering myself onto the bench beside him. The air between us was heavy with unspoken tension, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Finally, he broke the silence. "I can't do this anymore, Elise. I can't keep sneaking around, hiding how I feel. It's tearing me apart." "I know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But what are we supposed to do? This? Us? It can't happen." "Why not?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "You're unhappy, Elise. I see it every time I look at you, and I know I can give you the love you deserve." Tears welled in my eyes as I looked away. "It's not that simple." "Isn't it?" he pressed. "You have a choice, Elise. Stay in a marriage that's killing you, or take a chance on something real." His words struck a chord deep within me, the truth of them undeniable. But before I could respond, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and froze as I saw James's name on the screen. "Answer it," Robert said quietly, his voice steady. "You can't hide forever." I nodded, swallowing hard as I pressed the button to take the call. "Hi," I said, forcing a calmness into my voice. "Where are you?" James asked, his tone sharp. "I came home early, and you're not here." I went for a walk," I stammered, my mind racing. "I needed some fresh air." There was a pause on the other end, and then he said, "Come home. Now." The line went dead, leaving me trembling. I turned to Robert, my eyes wide with fear. He knows something's wrong. Robert reached for my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Whatever happens, you're not alone, Elise. Remember that." When I arrived home, James was waiting in the living room, his arms crossed and his expression grim. The air crackled with tension as I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice low but dangerous. "I told you I went for a walk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Don't lie to me, Elise," he snapped, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not stupid." I even felt the blood drain from my face as he pulled his phone from his pocket and held it up. On the screen was a photo. Me and Robert sitting on the bench at the park, our faces close, his hand resting on mine. "Who sent that to you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "What matters is that my wife, is sneaking around with my father." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth hung between us, undeniable and damning. "How long has this been going on?" James demanded, his voice rising. "James, please," I said, tears streaming down my face. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" he shouted, throwing the phone onto the couch. "So, you weren't at the park with him? You didn't betray me with him?" "It wasn't supposed to happen," I sobbed. "I didn't mean for any of this." "But it did," he roared, his face contorted with rage. "You did this, Elise. You destroyed us." His words cut deep, the weight of my actions crashing down on me. I reached for him, desperate to explain, but he stepped back, his eyes cold and distant. I can't look at you right now," he said, his voice trembling. "Get out." "James, please," I begged. "Let me explain." "Get out," he shouted, pointing toward the door. I hesitated for a moment before turning and fleeing the house, my vision blurred by tears. The night air was cold against my skin as I stumbled down the street, my heart shattered into a million pieces. I didn't know where to go or what to do. All I knew was that my life, as I had known it, was over. The night James told me to leave, felt like the end of everything I had known. With a hastily packed bag, I wandered the streets aimlessly, my mind drowning in regret, sorrow, and confusion. My actions had torn apart everything I thought was stable, leaving me with nothing but the wreckage of my choices. I stayed with a close friend during those first few days. The silence from James was crushing, but I knew I couldn't expect anything else. I had shattered his trust, and no apology could fix it. The weight of what I had done was inescapable. Robert called once during those early days. His voice was quiet, heavy with guilt. "Elise," he said softly, "I'm sorry for everything. I wish I could undo it." His words struck a chord, but they couldn't erase the damage. "We both made mistakes," I replied, my voice trembling, "but I think it's time we let each other go." There was a pause before he answered. "If you ever need anything, I'm here." I thanked him, knowing it would be the last time we spoke. Whatever we had shared, as real as it felt, had been built on a foundation of brokenness. Moving forward meant leaving it behind. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild myself. Therapy became a lifeline, a place where I could confront the loneliness and emotional void that had pushed me to the breaking point. I learned to own my choices without excusing them, to face the flaws in myself that I had ignored for too long. The process was painful, but necessary. James reached out a month later. His text was too short but loaded with meaning. "We need to talk." We met at the house. Walking through the door felt surreal. The walls, once filled with warmth, now seemed cold and unfamiliar. James greeted me with an expression I couldn't read: hurt, anger, and something else I couldn't define. "Why Elise?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why him? Why at all?" I took a deep breath, willing myself to face him honestly. "I was lonely," I said quietly. "For so long, I felt invisible. Robert, he made me feel seen." James's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "And you couldn't come to me?" Tears welled up as I shook my head. "I didn't know how. I didn't mean for it to happen, but I know I hurt you. I'm so sorry." His expression hardened, but I saw the pain behind his anger. "I don't know if I can forgive this." "I understand," I whispered, my voice breaking. "If you need to let go, I'll respect that. But I need you to know I never meant to destroy us." James nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of my words. "I need time." Months passed, and while the pain lingered, time softened its edges. James and I agreed to separate, the process marked by quiet acceptance rather than anger. Robert moved away, and I found myself wishing him well from afar, knowing our connection was something I had to let go. A year later, I returned to the park where it all began, sitting on that bench thinking. I reflected on everything I had learned. Life hadn't given me a clean resolution, but it had given me peace. I had faced my mistakes, rebuilt myself, and finally found the strength to move forward. As I left the park, I realized that I wasn't looking back anymore. I was ready for whatever came next to my life.